Hey, guess what I just did? It's election day, so I just exercised my precious right to vote. You often hear it referred to as your sacred right to vote, but the word sacred brings religion into it, and I don't remember a whole lot of voting going on in the Bible, or from what I know about them, the Torah or the Quran. So sacred seems a bit out of place to me. I call the right to vote precious because precious means valuable, and that seems more appropriate to me. If something is valuable, it's hard to get. It's widely desired. It's possibly subject to being stolen or would be sorely missed if lost. All of those things apply to voting, so I consider the right to vote precious. To have the right to vote and fail to exercise it is to reject something that was hard won. It's to insult those who fought hard to win it. It's to take for granted something that might too easily be taken away. I vote whenever I can, and I encourage every eligible voter in America to do the same, especially these days when the right to vote is in danger in so many parts of our country. So there's this story going around that somehow Democrats cheated and stole the 2020 election. Of course, it's total hogwash, and I know that people will believe what they want to believe almost no matter what reality tells them or tries to tell them. But just in case someone is listening who's open to a tiny shred of logic, I want to remind people of something. Remember way back in early 2020, before the pandemic and the whole election of November of that year, when it was all about Biden and Trump. But early in 2020, it was just the Democrats trying to decide which one of them would run for president. The first contest was in Iowa, of course, in February, I believe it was. Do you remember how that went? Democrats tried something new that year, some new voting app or something that was going to count the votes and report the results in the Iowa caucuses, and it was all a complete fiasco. It was a close contest, which would have kind of slowed things down anyway, but that wasn't really the problem. The problem was that new system they were trying. It was faulty. People didn't know how to work it. It hadn't been tested. And what would usually have taken a few hours or maybe a couple days took weeks. Meanwhile, while the Democrats were the laughing stock of the whole country, because they couldn't figure out who won their own election in Iowa. Remember those days? Now, does anybody really think, does this make any sense at all, that the same people who couldn't even run an election in Iowa for a few thousand votes in one state in February of 2020, only a few months later, they were able to pull off some nationwide fraud involving millions of votes in multiple states? Does any of that make sense? And somehow they did it without leaving behind any evidence. And when I say no evidence, there were how many? 60, 70, 80 separate lawsuits in local, state, and federal courts. Judges asked for evidence, and they were literally never shown any evidence. A truck in the night in Pennsylvania, a box under a table in Georgia, dead people voting in Arizona, Hugo Chavez manipulating voting machines from the grave. None of that. None of that was considered evidence by dozens of Republican and Democratic judges in multiple states because it was literally all nonsense. The same Democrats who flubbed Iowa somehow bamboozled the whole country and hid the evidence? If you believe that, you will literally believe anything. There's another story that also might not be true, but it's more worthy of our attention right now because it teaches us something very important about voting. The story goes something like this. Benjamin Franklin, who had just helped write the Constitution, was asked by someone who obviously hadn't read the Constitution yet what kind of government we Americans were going to have. Supposedly, Franklin's reply was a republic, if you can keep it. It's exactly the kind of witty, wise thing he would have said, so let's assume he did. But what did he mean? He meant that our Constitution was going to try to establish a republic in which the people would rule. The people would govern themselves. the people would be sovereign without the need for a king. That meant that instead of waiting around for decisions to be made for them, the people would have to take part in making those decisions, that they would have to participate in their own government, and that if they didn't, someone might come along someday and take their government away and start making decisions for them. He was warning us that democracies are fragile. Well, we can participate in our government in a lot of different ways, but perhaps the most important way is by voting, by helping to decide who will have power. But we, the people, have to be careful who we give power to. Most of the time, these days, we focus on party or issues. But this time, there's a more important question about our possible leaders that we have to ask. Do they really believe in democracy? Will they use their power to safeguard democracy itself? Will they give the people the chance to change their minds about them in free and fair elections in the future? Will they give up their power if they lose those future elections? Will they let us keep our republic, or will they take it away from us? I mention all this because this year we're having an election in which many people running for office simply don't believe in democracy at all. And they're pretty open about it. They come right out and say it. They say that the only legitimate outcome of the election is the one in which they win. But that's not democracy. I tell my students all the time, I've been voting for 40 years now, and roughly half the time the people I vote for lose. It's disappointing, but that's democracy. That's how democracy works. The adult thing to do is to accept it, move on, and hope for something better next time. Unfortunately, too many adults in this country have lost perspective and want their side to win so badly they've given up on democracy and they're trying to elect people who don't believe in it. But what will they do with our democracy once they get their hands on it? What happens in our future elections concerns me if certain people gain power over them. I believe our precious right to vote is in danger, that our democracy is in danger. I expect some bad news tonight in the coming days. I just hope it's kept to a minimum. Well, like I said, I voted today by walking down to my local elementary school, a neighborhood I've lived in for 30 years now, and exercised, along with the rest of my neighbors, my precious right to vote. All without the help of Hugo Chavez, by the way. Anyway, always remember to vote. It's your right, it's your privilege, and your duty as a citizen in a republic. When you do, always remember that the most important thing to vote for is not a certain party or idea or issue, but for democracy. Without that, you can't vote for anything else. Yo vote.